Thank you, Em. Everyone good with the lighting? Just leave them on? Okay. Well, thanks for the invitation to be here, and thanks for coming out. And for those online, I presume those are the cameras that they're, yeah, okay. Come on in, come on in. So as Em said, I professor in Orono for a long time with the Climate Change Institute, actually, and School of Forest Resources and the School of Food and Agriculture. That's what happens when you stick around for a very long time. And I continue to do work with around climate, and I direct the Maine Climate Science Information Exchange Office, which we won't get into. My day job is as a soil scientist, biogeochemist, and so I taught classes and spent a lot of time in labs and in different parts of particularly Maine, but other areas as well. Sampling soils and trees and crops and lots of surface waters and things like that, looking at mostly environmental impacts, but not solely, also impacts of forest management, nutrient cycling, and things like that. Sort of cut my teeth early on acid rain, and acid rain, A, we solved it, B, as that issue grew up, it became climate change. And I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. The charge is really the charge that we had for a similar talk at the Camden Library a few months back, focusing mostly on thoughts around forests and forest interaction with a changing atmosphere, with climate change per se. But you'll see when I talk about climate change, I think about it in a broader chemical and physical context, and I think about it both as being affected and how we, or how the forests also impact climate change itself. Part of the sort of how we got into this topic also was through the work at with the Maine Climate Council, and so I'm one of the 39 members of the Governor's Maine Climate Council, and I co-chair the Science and Technical Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council, which is 45 of Maine's scientists that study climate change. So I'll just talk a little bit about that at the end. If we're running out of time, a real little about that. So without further ado, basically that's what I just said. So let's get started talking about climate change. And when I think about climate change in Maine forests, effects on Maine forests, and so going in that direction. These are some of the prime things that I know probably most of you also think about, and perhaps some others that you're not thinking about when we try and understand how our landscape and how our forests are changing. So climate change and Maine forest effects. One of the changes that we talk about that is happening is a change in species ranges. And so many of you have heard the notion that spruce will be migrating out of the state because of a warming climate. What you're looking at there is actually a figure from a paleoecological study, meaning looking at forests over thousands of years, long term. Obviously there was or not obviously, but there was a glacier here 10,000 years or more ago, so it's relatively modern in a geological or archaeological sense. But nevertheless, 1,000 years ago, there were almost no spruce in the state. It was too warm. Although you'll see, I'm really used to walking around, so I suspect you can hear me when I walk around. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, I'll face the camera. So you can see the little shaded parts there of the state. Even then, coastal regions, probably here, served as a refugia for spruce. So there was some remnant spruce even at the time when there was almost no spruce in the state. 500 years ago, however, it warmed up, or it got cooler from the warmer part. And then the advance of the spruce to present, the modern distribution, represents the current climate we had. So the point being, spruce do move and do move in response to the climate. Spruce have not always been in Maine. They're in Maine now. And probably the warming will indeed drive them north. Nevertheless, that doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't mean that the spruce that are growing here are unhappy. In fact, I'll talk a little bit about, many of them are happier than they've ever been right now. And so it really has to do with the regeneration process, which is, a long-term process as to when some of these species actually move. A lot of times you'll see data maps that talk about the migration of species, and that map that you're looking at comes from our first Maine Climate Future report in 2009 here that we did out of the Climate Change Institute. On the left is the modeled current distribution of different species, and the top one is red spruce, and then balsam fir and red maple going down the list. And then to the right is, at the end of the century, what the distribution would be. Those maps, however, are usually maps and models of the niche, the environment, and the suitability of the environment for the regeneration and the sustaining of a particular species. It doesn't mean that the trees that are on the landscape are actually going to change as fast as that niche. It does mean that the probability of a regeneration of spruce is following that trend. So in many cases, spruce may be one of those examples. It'll take a long time before we actually don't see spruce along the Maine landscape. When we talk about shifting species, there's lots of different sort of estimates. This study of 3.8 feet a day is the rate of migration across the landscape. But the actual rates are both all over the board and directionally. They tend to be all north, although there's a few that are south, and they're northeast and northwest. And so it's not a monolithic migration of the forest we know now. In fact, it's a reassembly of the forest. So the forest that we will have won't look like the assemblages, or may not look like the assemblages that we know today. The northern hardwood forest has, these 5 species. Well, different species like white oak, et cetera, might be far more prevalent in what we know of now as a northern temperate forest mix. So shifting species is one of the effects of climate on our forests. Another one, second one on my hit list here, is changing growth factors. So changes in air quality in the atmosphere is as the focus of this discussion that impact trees. And the big problem with greenhouse gases, of course, is that they're increasing, the chief among them being carbon dioxide, CO2. It's going up. We all know that. It used to be 285 parts per million back before the Industrial Revolution, and now it's 400, and I don't know what it is today, but 415 or something like that. So it's gone up quite a bit, and yet you can fertilize most species out there with CO2 and they'll grow better. And so the CO2 effect on these forests itself is probably stimulating growth. I say probably because there's been instances where it's been demonstrated that that's happened. There's lots of models that suggest that's happening or will happen or be evident in the future. But that doesn't mean we see that clearly in all of the data. Nevertheless, that's a positive, that's a growth stimulating factor as compared to things that have a negative impact on our forests. We have declining ozone. O3 is ozone. And how many have heard of the ozone hole? Right? Yeah. So that's the bad ozone. That's the good ozone. This is the bad ozone. So the good ozone is a natural ozone layer in the stratosphere that filters out ultraviolet light, which is what gives us skin cancer in simple terms. But that's pretty much the headline of the story. And as we in the past have released, propellants that we've used in spray cans, et cetera, they rise up and destroy, calm down, the ozone hole. or create the ozone hole, destroying ozone, allowing more ultraviolet light to penetrate, giving us a higher cancer risk, impacting wildlife, impacting plant species, et cetera. The Montreal Protocol has been very successful at reducing the emissions of those kinds of compounds, hydrofluorocarbons, and the ozone hole is recovering. That's a good thing. In the troposphere, the atmosphere that we live in and that we pollute with exhaust, et cetera, we create tropospheric ozone, and that's the bad ozone, smog, if you would. And we do it every day. We're doing a lot of it right now. My eyes are burning from driving down along the coast today because the ozone levels are pretty high and the warnings are out. And that's because sunlight, volatile organic carbons that are emitted, when you're filling your gas tank and you see those fumes, those are VOCs, and nitrous oxide that all sorts of combustion releases into the atmosphere. That's the soup that gets turned into ozone with sunlight and higher temperatures. And so we see a diurnal pattern, a daily pattern of that ozone that produces the highest concentrations. The maximum rate of production is around 2 in the afternoon. The maximum concentrations are a couple hours after that because we get up, we drive our vehicles, we emit these fumes. They do in Boston, and it's riding up on the dominant air current along the coast. And during the day, that cooks, and it continues to produce tropospheric ozone. And then it declines now at the end of the day. That's a lot to say. Simply say that ozone reduces growth. And so you can take any plant, you can take that tree for sure here in Rockland, and put it in a chamber or a collar around it that filters the ozone, the tropospheric ozone, and it will grow better. So the ozone that we're creating in the troposphere has a negative impact. The plants spend energy to try and repair tissues that are damaged by that ozone. It's an oxidant, and that's why your eyes burn and with smog, et cetera. The good news is we've decreased the emissions of compounds that cause that ozone. And so tropospheric ozone concentrations have declined over the last couple of decades as a result of the Clean Air Act and controls on particularly nitrogen emissions and VOCs as well. This little chart in here is just the results of a study making the point that ozone has a negative impact. So these are all different components of plants that were treated or exposed to different levels of ozone. And by and large, most of the biomass in different components is decreased because the plant is using up energy just repairing tissue rather than building tissue. The rising CO2 stimulates growth. The declining ozone also is a positive impact on trees because there's less of it now, and so that's another factor that's encouraging tree growth. We also have declining nitrogen deposition. Nitrogen and sulfur are two bad actors for acid rain. And back in the early 1980s, we were kind of at the peak of acid rain, the greatest amount of acidity in the rain. And what was in that was sulfuric acid and nitric acid, and the sulfur and the nitrogen came from combustion of primarily fossil fuels. Same stuff that we're burning and giving us CO2. The Clean Air Act did a great job of cleaning up the sulfur big time. I haven't looked at data for Rockland. I've worked up data from Acadia. We have about 80% less sulfur deposition now than we did back at the beginning of the 1980s. And we have about half the nitrogen deposition, directly as a result of the Clean Air Act and some ozone rules that followed that, particularly for nitrogen. So that's where science-informed policy has done a lot of good stuff. That's the good news. The bad news is nitrogen and sulfur are both also essential nutrients. Nitrogen's the most limiting plant nutrient on the planet. Pretty much everywhere you go, unless it's a polluted area. If you fertilize it with nitrogen, it is going to want to grow better, and usually it will grow better. So we were getting free nitrogen from the sky that in some cases promoted growth, even while it was also the cause of acidification and acid rain. And so some cases that was a positive, other cases that was a negative. Point here being declining end deposition means that we were already deficient with nitrogen. That's the way our world works. Before acid rain, we had a little bit of nitrogen coming from the acid rain for a few decades, probably benefited from that part of it, and now we don't. And so some of that free nitrogen from the sky is not being delivered, and so that's a negative on forest growth, forest health, and productivity. Yeah.
How did acid rain affect nitrogen-fixing microbes?
Good question. I'm not a microbiologist to be able to say or take blame as an expert. So grain of salt. But it usually would inhibit organisms that would thrive in nitrogen deficient systems. And so if you increase the amount of nitrogen, then those symbioses that occur between like mycorrhiza and tree roots or the nitrogen fixers in the soil are diminished because they're, whatever the system is that makes them want to do that, want to thrive, is dependent on their producing that nitrogen. And when the nitrogen is abundant and free, there's kind of no need, ecologically, there's not as much of a need for them. So most of the time, nitrogen fixers and symbiotic mycorrhizal relationships with roots went down when nitrogen availability goes up, fertilization or pollution. Make sense? Increased precipitation, we all know that we've got more precipitation, we have more extreme precipitation events, and so we have more extremes in climate. We're living it this year, right? Yeah, I mean, we had a really wet spring, it rained, rained every Saturday, it felt like, and now it just stopped, and it's just, we've gone into a flash drought inside of 2 weeks. That's kind of classic climate change behavior. Overall, though, we're getting more precipitation. That little plot there is just from Russ Briggs, who worked at the Cooperative Forestry Research Unit back 25 years ago now. And he developed this little hand guide, and what it's showing you there are different classes of soil conditions, primarily the drainage. And so this is a soil profile going down, in this case, 36 inches. And then this zone is mottled, which is what the coloration, the little splotchiness of soils as they start to get wet. And then when they get really wet, they're gray. And what this is showing is the class 1, the best growth sites, have the deepest roots and the most productivity. They're freely drained. They're not saturated. And as you get, basically as you go down slope, the soils get wetter and wetter and wetter. And the growth class gets worse. Rooting depth gets worse, productivity above ground gets worse. Message here is that as we have increased precipitation and our soils get wetter, it will decrease. It's going to drive the system this way. It'll decrease the productivity of some sites because they're simply too wet. And this has been a really strong relationship in Maine soil-site relationships, site index for forests, the correlation between soil drainage class and site productivity. And so more rain is going to push it in the wrong direction. If we have more rain, we have increased erosion. That's just some data from one of my students that was looking at rates of erosion as rainfall goes up. No surprise. The soil loss tons per acre goes up. But you see a fallow field that's bare has a huge loss when we get these, and what we're getting more of is these 3, 4, and 5 inch rain events. So we're kind of in this zone. Row crops are worse, lawns and pastures are less vulnerable, and forests are the best. So the message there is that we're getting more erosion, but as long as we keep our forests and our forest floor intact and protected, the site is well protected from this kind of an erosion risk. When we don't, when we tear up the forest floor when we're harvesting and we put more roads than we really need, then we quickly lose a lot of these forest soils that are used to being protected under the forest floor. Drought, which we're heading into now. So a lot of times when I've used this slide, I've got to say, yes, we have drought here in Maine at times, and times would be right now. So yeah, we're wet, but we're not immune to drought. And there's formal drought. There's 3 different kinds: meteorological and agricultural and hydrological drought, which are really, really dry conditions. But we also frequently have periods of soil moisture deficit that don't technically qualify for drought, and we have those a lot more. We'll see in the fall, winter onset doesn't come as fast. We get a wet September, but then it doesn't rain all that much after that, and yet it's still warm enough to grow. And so we are experiencing more frequent instances of moisture deficit that is impacting forest growth. And if it's wet, something happened? Oh, okay. I'm hearing something. Okay. As long as it's not an emergency. And it doesn't take much of moisture stress to impact forest growth. So things can be good for a long period of time, and then for a few weeks, you have real severe drought, and it has an impact on growth. It particularly has an impact on like little seedlings, regeneration that have little fine roots. It doesn't take long to kill them without the available moisture. We have increased soil freezing. A lot of changes in the winter that impact our forests. And this is just a little fun graph from, I had students that did a snow removal study called the vernal transition that they were looking at. They were primarily focused on what happens in the spring. So vernal meaning spring, transition, the transition from winter to summer. But they did the research through the whole winter. They did it for 2 years. And this year, in 2015, we had a lot of snow. And what we had is plots where they would remove snow from one plot, shovel it, and leave the snow intact in the control to look at soil temperatures, which is what's being plotted there, to see how they differed because of and what we were looking at is the insulation value of having a snowpack protecting the soil in the winter. Fun fact, 2015 was like the first year they started, the snowiest year we've had since then. It just snowed all year, it was really deep, it lasted really late. So they spent their whole winter out there with shoveling the treated plots. The next year was a really wimpy year. We had 8 snow melt events. And so it was good contrast, but it was a lot of work. What you're looking at here, though, the story here is so this line is soil temperature with a snowpack intact. And what you see is it barely ever freezes. It's always just above freezing. So the soil is always just above freezing. So you get very, very little frost impact with that. Without the snowpack, it really gets cold. Freezes hard, heaves, and what we found is that there are impacts on the microbial communities. There's impact on roots from that kind of freezing. And in that study, we reported on something called concrete frost. Concrete frost happens when the soil is saturated. And so if you get a rain on, it was the following year that it happened though. If you get a rain on snow event and the temperatures are warm so the water can percolate in, then it fills all the pores of the soil. And if the next day the temperature drops and plummets, which it does in the winter to -10, And so we had one event in particular where it was a very thin snowpack, it rained on it, and 24 hours later, the temperature dropped to, I think, like -10, I forget. And so now all the pores are filled with water. They're going to expand, just like the milk bottle on the porch, but there's nowhere to expand because the pores, there's no empty pores for it to expand into within the matrix of the soil. So it builds up a lot of pressure, it probably will heave, but also fine roots, microbial communities that are sitting in that soil get crushed, literally get crushed. And so that's called concrete frost when you have that happen as compared to the regular frost. So changes in winter can have an important effect that we're just beginning to discover on forests. An example of where that can impact trees, this is 20 years ago, this became, for a while, a mystery. But yellow cedar up in Alaska along the coastal zones, like us here, was experiencing dieback. And they live on a relatively wet soil habitat. What was happening is the climate warming was reducing the snow. In the spring in particular, you'd get an early dehardening of the tree, so it would start to want to grow and start to have succulent tissues. But they were still getting frost events as the spring sort of transitioned into summer. But those frost events now would kill roots because the roots had started to grow and try to grow. Enough so that you created a dieback. That phenomenon is, there's a potential for that in lots of coastal areas around the world. I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that happening widespread, and I've not seen any reports of that or studies of that specifically happening here in Maine. Now in Maine we have a lot of rocky coasts and rocky systems as well, but in the clays you certainly could have that kind of a phenomenon. Phenology is altered. Phenology is the study of when things do what they do. So when do the leaves turn color? When do butterflies molt, et cetera. And that's a plot of different organisms from a study showing the changes that are taking place in phenology, the timing of biological processes, as a result of a warming world. And the message being they're not all lined up. It's not like everything shifts 2 weeks from what it did before. So the ecological processes are simply different, but B, there are some important ones that now this kind of a phenomena is creating asynchronies. So if a certain flower is used to being pollinated by a certain insect that was at a certain phase that coincided at the same time, and now this insect is not molting, it's molting 2 weeks later, but the flower is out 3 weeks later, you have an asynchrony in that kind of biological process. And so those kinds of effects can impact some of the processes with forest trees as well. Changes in insects and disease. Not every pest and pathogen impacting forests is impacted by climate change, but a number of them are. And that's a distribution plot for hemlock woolly adelgid that probably will wipe out a lot of the hemlocks that we have. It's doing a good job in southern New England and the Atlantic states. We have emerald ash borer. That's a real risk to ash that has a climate component. What do I say? Leaf roller? Beech leaf. Disease is kind of a brand new entry in the last few years, and the climate connection's still being studied there, but that's before we talk about beech bark disease. That had an indirect climate connection. Beech leaf disease is probably going to kill them far faster than beech bark disease. So these kinds of pests are an important part of thinking about how our forests change and modeling how our forests change. So I started by showing range shifts, and those are sort of modeled under these conditions. That's where this tree likes to grow. but it's not considering all these other disturbances. And so we really need to factor those in, because these kinds of factors could in fact wipe out spruce before its time. And so you'd get a more rapid change. There's nothing attacking spruce in the southern part of the state. Spruce budworm, that you probably know or have heard of, is attacking the northern part, and there's really not a clear climate driver for that. And then forest operations, thinking about the effects on forests, meaning how we manage, how we schedule the management of forests. Particularly, I'm showing you a big truck, particularly on an industrial scale. We like to harvest forests in the winter when the ground is frozen. And so that first winter in our snow removal study, 2015, when it snowed all winter and it was always a snowpack, even though the ground wasn't frozen, there was a snowpack protecting it, so that would get packed down. And a lot of times, once it's open, the ground will freeze, as you saw. That will protect it. The next year, 2016, I think we had 8 snowmelt events. That meant 8 times it warmed up, the snow disappeared, and we get snow, really thin snowpack. That is impossible to do that kind of harvesting on, and so a real challenge for some of these extensive industrial operations. And then when we think about forests, the forest economy, forest markets, what happens elsewhere matters here. And so these are 2 pictures. The upper one is the picture of pine bark and spruce beetle infestations in Canada and western United States that have killed millions of acres of those species, changing the market conditions that impact us here in Maine. And then the picture of the southeastern part of the United States is simply to send, that's from a study of, modeled for WASI, precip change, pointing to there's also already moisture deficit challenges to forest production in the Southeast. And the Southeast produces a lot of wood, yellow pine in particular. But it's also in the bullseye of drought stress going forward. And so they've got big challenges, and they're often competing for some of the same markets as our northern species. So this has to do with the markets that impact how we use the forests here in Maine, and the markets that support our commercial forestry. Okay, so climate change in Maine forests, a couple of other topics that I won't go into on the same granular level. We love our forests for recreating, of course. In fact, most small woodlot owners have that as a priority, and sort of handing it to the family, as compared to simply a return on investment. So hunting, fishing, hiking. If you're here tonight to hear about forests, I suspect you do some of or all of those kinds of things, and really value our forest lands because of it. There are specific products lines that are really important: maple syrup and maple production. We don't produce maple all over the country. We only produce maple in cooler temperate climates. And the changing climate is changing the dynamics of that. You're not going to see maple syrup production go away anytime soon in Maine, but probably the thing I hear the most is just simply the variability, the unpredictability from one year to the next, as far as managing these kinds of operations. Tourism, leaf peepers, and hikers and campers that come to Maine are enjoying the vistas of our forests, are in our forests as they're carrying out those activities. So as our forests change, it has a direct impact on that component. And culturally, our forests are important. They're important to all of us if we enjoy the woods and walk in nature and hike and appreciate it. The arts, spiritually, and certainly in Native Americans and indigenous cultures that put high value on forests. So lots of different values that are being impacted by a changing climate, simply because the forest itself, its character and its behavior is changing. And then human health, operating, why I put Lyme there, is operating in the forest, or playing in the forest, or letting my grandkids go out in the forest, when before it was all, yeah, you'll live through the mosquitoes, go out and enjoy it. For the oldest grandchildren, now it's like, no, I'm going to cover you head to toe like an astronaut before you go out and roll around in the forest. I suspect some of you've dealt with some of those kinds of impacts. High heat stress, we've had a lot of that this summer, you know, working in the woods, working outside anywhere. Heat stress is the #1 climate-related impact, more than some other diseases. And so also Maine forests impact the climate. So I've mostly talked about impacts of a changing climate on the forests. The forests are part of that dynamic and that process. And probably the one everyone's most familiar with is carbon uptake, carbon sequestration. And so we talk a lot about, and there's industries being developed around promoting the capture and sequestration, retention of carbon in natural ecosystems. Forests are pretty much leading the pack. Certainly in Maine, forests are leading the pack because we're 89% forested. And both above ground and below ground. The below ground is a slower process, so most of the action is above ground. But there's twice as much carbon in the soil as there is above ground, so the below ground carbon is important as well. And so in order to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, we need to reduce the emissions, the rate of emissions. But also we want to do things that will take up the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And so that's what carbon sequestration is about. That's a picture of a tower above the forest canopy in Howland, Maine, about a half hour north of Bangor. That is an Ameriflux site that studies very intensively the exchange of CO2 between the atmosphere and a pretty large footprint of that forest canopy. And those are the absolute best measurement systems for being able to define the net flux, meaning how much goes up, how much goes down, and what is more stored or is more emitted. Albedo is a word that describes the reflectivity of something. And so, you know, those of us with black vehicles, they get really hot. And those with white vehicles, it reflects more of the sunlight because of the color. And so snow has a really high albedo, and dark things have a really low albedo. And there's a significant difference between deciduous and coniferous forests. Both have pretty low albedo compared to a snowpack, which is really bright, reflects a lot of energy. But nevertheless, as you go from a coniferous forest to a deciduous forest, depending on the species mixes that you have, a deciduous forest has a higher albedo. It means it reflects more of the light, 15 to 20%. Whereas a coniferous forest is really dark, and so it absorbs most of the energy, that therefore changes it into heat, and so they'll cause more of a warming of the atmosphere. And so the albedo and which species we choose to plant are important. Water vapor is the most dominant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. It's largely responsible for the planet being habitable to start with. And vegetation through evapotranspiration has a direct impact on the amount of water vapor, particularly locally. Tropical forests can create their own microclimate around them because of the amount of water vapor that's being transpired primarily into that atmosphere. And so if you go from a forest to a grassland or a pasture setting, you're going to end up with lower rates of water vapor being contributed to the atmosphere, and therefore less of a driver of climate change that does have local effects. And then fire, and sometimes people are like, yeah, but we don't have fires here in Maine. I suspect most of you are like, yeah, that's a good one. So we have, big fires now out west every year, Western United States, Western Canada. We breathe the smoke at times, all the way over here in Maine. And now we have our own fires. We've had, I think it's 500 fires this year in Maine, and about 100 of them in August. The month isn't over yet. And so really dry conditions, of course, promote the risk of fire even here. And of course, that blows away that. So if you burn the forest, you did a great job for 20 years sequestering carbon, and you have a forest fire, it goes up in a puff of smoke. So those are the sort of scientific, ecological, biogeochemical interactions between climate and forest that I wanted to just raise your awareness of, and think about more than just CO2 or more than just warming as this dynamic mix. And so I showed you some things that promote growth, some things that inhibit growth. What's the net effect? Well, we're still learning what the net effect is. Right now, spruce trees are growing better than they were before we got to this level in warming because of CO2 and because it's warmer. The reason they end up getting pushed out is mostly through competition with hardwoods, who migrate north with a warming climate, not because the spruce aren't happy growing there. You can grow them in your front lawn in pretty warm climates, as long as something's not competing with it. Now I want to just do a shift to look at climate change adaptation, what things are happening. And I'm going to use this just one study. And so those are the results of the study. Any questions on that? No. So this is a study by a few different people. Rachel Chapman's at the University of Maine. She was in Vermont, where Tony D'Amato is. Todd Ontel works for the U.S. Forest Service, and was bright enough to move from where he was to Maine, and now is a Maine resident. And Tessa McGann was a graduate student that did this study. The study was looking at interviewing foresters in New England and asking, what are the climate impacts that you're seeing? What are you doing about it? What are your barriers to be able to adapt? And that is, in fact, their data. We're not going to go through it. Very interesting, though, to see those lines of connection. I'm going to summarize it, though. So when asked about the most significant challenges to meeting their goals, rural participants often responded with weather as the challenge to meeting their management goals overall. And discussions of weather-related concerns most often centered on the challenges to harvesting trees posed by increasing winter temperatures, which we already talked about, wetter and longer springs, and more frequent extreme rain events. And so those are common themes that I think probably most of us in the room can identify with as the kind of modern changes in our climate. If we look at, I'm extracting this column of visual data into a simple list, and the big thick line here is silvicultural prescriptions as far as the kind of adaptations that foresters in New England are using. And silvicultural prescriptions mean changing the way that we harvest forests and manage those forests, and that's what silviculture refers to, in mind of creating a forest that's more resilient to the changes we're experiencing, and to some extent also the changes we expect. All of those are different management strategies address the challenges of a changing climate. And some are pretty modest modifications of what we're already doing, and others are more not advanced, but more novel in the context of climate change. The next column was, they asked them about the barriers to adaptation. You know, what do foresters find to be the biggest problems to be able to implement the kind of adaptation management they're thinking about? And the two top ones in the list were public perception, so management of the forest that particularly visually the public objected to, and economics, the market support for managing forests. And a good example of that here in Maine is if we could do early entry into forest stands and harvest a lot of the small material that would give better growing conditions to the larger trees, that would be beneficial. But we need a market for the small material in order to pay for that operation. And so there's a lot of interest in, can we use that small material as a fuel? Can we use that small material in producing various products now that we're learning to make with nanocellulose that comes from forests? And then barriers to solutions, the last column, engaging with the public or having the opportunity and the support and resources to do that, and collaborating and being able to work together. There's a lot of emphasis now, and some of these folks are leading programs around peer-to-peer learning that's supported by funding. So that gives you an idea of some of the things that are happening relative to managing our forests. A whole bunch of different kinds of reports have come out in the last few years that focused on carbon, focused on adaptive silviculture, that you can find them online, and I certainly, you can email me, I'll point you in that direction. This is a menu of adaptation strategies that's put out by this group's been pretty effective in climate adaptation work, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Sciences. And there's 10 major headings there. I'm going to boil them down even more. If you go through that, and you can download that fact sheet, they kind of boil down to these 5 factors: sustain healthy and redundant ecological function. So you want redundancy so that there is resilience against the stresses of the changing climate and others. Reduce stressors. If climate is an additional stress, then try to be more aggressive at managing stressors such as overcrowding, such as disease and insects. Maintain refugia, which we talked about. Maintain areas that you know are a place where certain species or assemblages do really well as they're struggling elsewhere. Then focus here so that we can at least preserve a source of those species and those conditions, so that if opportunity exists, those can expand. And then connectivity, and particularly in land conservation area, connectivity is really important. So there's an emphasis in land conservation of getting parcels that are connected. So as species from the animal and the plant world want to migrate or attempt to migrate, they can migrate. You don't have a city and a road network in between. You're not going to get there from here. But if you have these conservation lands that are linked together, it provides that opportunity. And then in some cases, facilitate transitions. And so that's kind of a buzzword for the most popular of that is assisted migration, which is taking seedlings, and there's some of that activity going on in the state, taking seedlings from further south in Maine or south of Maine and planting them up here in anticipation of the climate that they're going to grow up in over the next 25, 50, 100 years. Much to do about forest carbon. I'll go quickly on this to for the sake of time, there's a lot of interest, energy, excitement, and some really good stuff going on around carbon. These two terms are pretty important: carbon storage versus carbon sequestration. Carbon storage is the amount of carbon, the absolute amount. Carbon sequestration is the rate at which carbon is being taken up or released, or at least it's used in a few different ways, but that's the way technically in the sort of forest ecology world we're using it. And why that's important is you'll hear a lot about old growth forests, and they have a lot of carbon storage. And I'm a soil scientist, so I go around telling everyone that there's a lot of carbon storage in the soil. But the rate at which new carbon is pulled out of the atmosphere doesn't necessarily match the carbon storage. So we have a lot of carbon storage in old growth forests, but not none, but a lower rate of carbon sequestration in old growth forests. So that young forest that's regrowing is sucking up a lot of carbon, but it has much less carbon in storage. Soils have a huge amount of carbon, but they take up carbon relatively slowly compared to the above ground vegetation. So these concepts are pretty important, and sometimes they get mixed up in the discussions. And to illustrate how carbon changes over time, this is the volume of carbon, the amount of carbon, as a forest goes from young to old. You get a lot more carbon over time. But this is the rate of sequestration. And so young forests take up carbon quickly, and that rate of sequestration slowly diminishes. Now, some have gone around on the other side of the coin saying old growth forests aren't old growth, they're not taking up any carbon. They're not helping sequestration. That's not true. We now know from studies that even the old growth forests are still taking up carbon more than we said before. So they're both valuable as storing it. And of course, if the idea is to cut the old growth forest and use the wood so that you have a new forest, most of what you're going to do with that wood is going to get turned into CO2 and be back in the atmosphere. So that's not a good strategy. I'll just show you this. You can download them for anyone that's really interested in carbon. A group of us work on the carbon budget for the state in support of greenhouse gas reporting for the state. And we've done two versions of the Maine carbon budget 2 years ago, and then the most recent one we did in support of the most recent greenhouse gas report. And what a statewide carbon budget entails is measurements of all of the greenhouse gas emissions, mostly from fossil fuel combustion, and then how much is being taken up and coming out of the woods, out of farms, out of urban areas, out of wetlands, coastal wetlands, and then what goes out to sea. Take-home message here is that we're 89% forested. Our forests have been harvested relatively vigorously, managed, and so they're taking up a lot of carbon. And so about 91% of the greenhouse gases that are emitted in Maine are taken up by one of these boxes, but almost all of that box is forest. There's some sequestration in wetlands. There's a lot of carbon in wetland soils, for sure, but there's only a small area relative coastal wetlands over here, compared to the 17 million acres of forest that we have. So our forests, they weren't always a net sink. So 30 years ago, they were a net source of CO2. But right now, they're a net sink of carbon. And so if we're going to meet our goals of carbon neutrality by 2045, as our current climate action plan calls for, we've got to track this stuff. But we're not that far from carbon neutral right now. That doesn't mean that we're not emitting greenhouse gases. We are. A lot of it from fossil fuel combustion. So we really want to do both. We want to sequester as much as possible, and we want to limit greenhouse gas emissions. This 91% being sequestered is telling us the net greenhouse gas emissions. We also have reported since 2004 gross greenhouse gas emissions. And so gross greenhouse gas emissions is what's the total amount of greenhouse gases Maine has emitted. And that peaked in the 2000s, and it's about, I forget what, 30% now, less than it was in 1990. But we have a long way to go to get to zero. Yeah.
Is that, when they're talking about carbon emission, you're only talking about any activity that is within the state, not, for instance, if we import material from outside the state and it has carbon emissions, that doesn't count towards this number.
Right, basically, yes. So this is sort of IPCC style carbon budgets that are based on the geography of the state. That's the consumption-based carbon budget. And we're working on that as well. That one's far more complicated because we're not measuring many of those flux. So, right, that's not counting that. I'm not going to get into that for time. And just take a couple of minutes. I'm going to segue now just to talk about, how many have heard of Maine Won't Wait? Oh, good. In 2019, the governor signed into law a law that created the Maine Climate Council, 39-member council. And the charge of the council was to develop a climate action plan for the state. In 2004, we had a mitigation plan, but it didn't include adaptation. And we met all of those goals, which is great, but there were no goals beyond 2020 in that plan. And so this is the first time we both had new goals for climate action beyond 2020 and mitigation all rolled into one integrated plan. In support of the Climate Council and the work that they do, there's 6 working groups. I'll show you that really quickly. And then there's a science committee, science and technical subcommittee. And I co-chair that with Susie Arnold, who's a scientist right over here at the Island Institute here in Rockland. The STS is Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, is charged with developing a science assessment and so we started to do that at the Climate Change Institute back in 2009. We did an update in 2015 and an update in 2020. All those are online. You can just Google Maine Climate Future and it'll take you to the CCI website. And then the Science and Technical Subcommittee produced a pretty extensive science assessment in 2020 in support of the first Maine Won't Wait document, which is the name of our state's climate action plan. We did an update in 2021, and then just this past year, we released another extensive, it's an update, but it's an extensive update. That was like 370 pages, this is like 280 pages. Update of the science about Maine to support decision-making here in Maine. We've got IPCC, we have the National Climate Assessment, or at least we did up until recently. Different speech. But the goal here was to have science that was local to drive local decisions. And so that's what we do. This is pictures of people that are neighbors that are scientists doing the science, but also sitting on this STS to produce those reports. And all of this is in support of developing the Climate Action Plan. The co-chairs of the council are Sarah Curran, who's the director of the, she's one of the co-coordinator of the council and director of the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, and Melanie Loisem, who's the commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection. And that's the picture of the most recent Maine Won't Wait report. The council itself is supported by, so there's a 39-member council, there's us, the Science and Technical Subcommittee, there's an Equity Subcommittee, and then there's these 6 working groups that are charged with developing recommendations to the council for what goes into the final climate action plan. And so the way this works is we do the science assessment, everyone gets the latest science. These groups meet typically for a year, really intensively, hand up recommendations, and then 6 months later, this group develops the climate action plan that we have today. And the climate action plan's high-level goals are to, no surprise, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, strengthen resilience to climate impacts, the adaptation part, create jobs and economic prosperity to build the economy as we're doing that, and to bring climate action to all Maine people, so to achieve the equity goals of the action plan. The action plan has, the new action plan has 7, the other one had 8, a couple were combined. High-level strategies that have a whole bunch of recommendations. Of course, this is the update 2 years later, so a lot of these recommendations, there's a lot already going on to implement them. Now I'm going to trip myself here. So the first 3 have to do with energy, reducing fossil fuels, making our buildings more efficient. The star of that has been the installation of heat pumps throughout the state. And these 4 are about building the kind of the green economy. E is what we've been talking about tonight, protecting the environment, natural and working lands, which is a code for forests and agricultural lands and wetlands, and waters here in Maine. Working on communities, a lot of investment through the Community Resilience Program, and then in education, outreach, engaging in Maine people and youth on climate action. Websites are out there that give you the climate action plan, give you all sorts of resources as individuals, communities, and examples and case studies of how people are kind of getting the job done. Closing thoughts. Most indicators of climate change, this is kind of ending with a Debbie Downer, but most indicators of climate change are continuing and accelerating. Meaning, if you ask about, is it warming, is sea level rising, is the ocean acidifying? Yes, all of that continues. And the rate at which those continue is increasing. And so we haven't bent the curve yet. Science-informed climate solutions are also accelerating. And so even though there's a war on science right now, a lot of the science that I alluded to tonight has informed policy that has, in fact, helped design, implement solutions, all the way back to acid rain, which we essentially solved by science-informed policy. But not fast enough. Obviously, or not obviously, but in a lot of contexts, the climate is accelerating right now, this year, farms and forests and fighting fires. We don't have the systems that are mature and funded that allow us to be a little more relaxed about that. We're running around a bit in a panic as we deal with this. Science-informed climate solutions are cost-effective. I say that a lot, which means that not every adaptation, not everything that we could do is cost-effective to do. But all of the science-informed adaptations pay back more than they cost. Now, how it's distributed in society is one of the challenges, and certainly industries want the money to go there versus other places. But I've done a lot with Clean Air Act. I've been on advisory panels for EPA in Washington over these things over the years. If we look at lead in gas, if we look at mercury restrictions, if we look at acid rain, and we look at the benefits of what it costs to implement those policies, it's paid back many times over. I was deeply embedded in one around acid rain that looked at the first 20 years of acid rain regulations, and they paid back about, on the median, $30 to American society for every dollar invested to reduce sulfur emissions. And so we see that in the cost of adaptation. Look at the storms that hit us just 1 year of storms, where we got 2 storms back to back, and we're paying for that over years. And so the cost of building resilience is always science-informed. cost effective. And Maine Won't Wait is a pathway for hope and an iterative process because business as usual is not an option. And I particularly say that, that word on hope. In our last science assessment, we had a chapter on hope. And our muse in that is that my co-chair, Susie Arnold, from here at the Island Institute, talking about hope as having obviously a good feeling, but the science of hope is there's three key components for that. And one is having goals, and we talked about the goals in the Climate Action Plan, and so Maine Won't Wait it gives us that. Having a pathway, so how do you get to those goals? That also is embodied in Maine Won't Wait. And having agency, which is social scientist term for meaning what can we do that get involved. And so there's a lot that we can do. Personal decisions that we make, voting booth, and engagement in some of the kinds of things that are embodied in the Climate Action Plan are reason for hope, because we are making a very positive impact as we carry that out. So we're getting close to when we're going to be ejected, but that's my story and I'm sticking to it. I thank you for being here.